Hmm. I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Tracee Stanley. Tracee is the author of the best-selling book, Radiant Rest, Yoga Nidra for Deep Relaxation and Awakened Clarity, and her new book, The Luminous Self, Sacred Yogic Practices and Rituals to Remember Who You Are. Tracee is the founder of Empowered Life Circle, a sacred community and portal of practices, rituals, and tantric teachings inspired by more than 25 years of studentship in Sri Vidya Tantra and the teachings of the Himalayan masters. As a post-lineage teacher, Tracee is devoted to sharing the wisdom of Yoga Nidra, rest, meditation, self-inquiry, nature as teacher, and ancestor reverence. Tracee was on Love and Liberation a little while back, and so you can listen to that episode where we focused more on Yoga Nidra. By visiting the show notes, you'll see a link there for that episode. I'm really happy we get to do a part 2 on the arrival of your new book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading it, and thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful to be with you again.
And I thought because so much of the book, the essence of it is connecting with our true nature, then maybe you could talk about some of the qualities that help us differentiate between true self, authentic self, and the smaller sense of self.
Yeah, true nature. It's such a big question. And I think that, when we think about true nature, I like to think about asking these questions around who am I? And in the book, I talk about kind of the one teacher who's really kind of popularized and made this his life's work, Sri Ramana Maharshi, who's no longer in body, but his teachings endure. And this is the original self-inquiry question. This is the original kind of practice of vichara, which is this practice of deliberation and deliberation in the kind of quest to find the source of something or the seed of something or the origin of something. And I think that when we think about our true nature, we can think about this question of who am I, which seems really big and can be very confusing because we have so many things that we wear and so many masks that we've put on and so many things that we've taken on that or inherited that aren't even ours. That for me, a lot of times the question to ask is, who am I not? And then we get to start to peel away these layers. And I think the question really allows us to kind of sit with this possibility that we are so much more than we think we are. And in practice, I think sometimes maybe people listening have had an experience of this spaciousness or expansiveness that seemed to come out of nowhere. And I would offer that that is a little glimpse into our true nature. And a lot of times we think that, oh, it's because of the practice, or it's because of this teacher, or there's something external that has happened that happened to me, as opposed to something that is actually being revealed because we took some time to be still, or we took time to be in nature, or we took time to just be with our breath for just a couple of cycles of breath. And then suddenly we start to feel this expansive, restful, beautiful place. And I don't want to I don't want to put like a label on what true self means because I think it's the journey of our life. But I do think that when we connect to a deeper relationship with ourselves, a deeper relationship with the natural world, a release of our fear of silence and stillness, that some of these kind of feelings of, oh, I'm this is also part of me can come forward.
In your book, you ask this question of who is really the imposter? And it lets this practice be so relatable.
Oh, thank you for highlighting that. You know, it was interesting because over the last few years, I felt like I was starting to hear a lot from teachers and people that I was mentoring that, oh, I feel like an imposter. And I'm like, well, what exactly does that mean to be an imposter? It's like this is something that the overculture has been really adept at making us feel that we're not enough, that we're not worthy, that you don't know enough. You still need another certification. You still need another degree. You still need someone else to give you the gold star and say, yes, it's okay. And, you know, what I was noticing is that this imposter syndrome was not coming from kind of new teachers, but people who had, you know, master's degrees and PhDs and had been teaching and practicing for decades. That there was still this feeling of when we started to kind of dig underneath it of not enoughness. And so I started to do a little bit of research about this idea of imposter syndrome, especially when I was writing the book and reading these definitions of imposter syndrome from, you know, things like psychology today. It just felt like, oh, this is really us not trusting our gifts. This is really us not trusting our inner knowing. This is us not trusting that all of the work that we've done, all of the classes we've done, all of the certifications that we've done have not given us a foundation to be able to trust in what we know and then have the courage to share what we know and then learn as we continue, right? It's like always to me, there's like a learning happening not only because you're learning about whatever it is that you're sharing or teaching, but you're learning from the people that you are sharing with. And then everybody becomes a teacher. So it almost feels like if we can release this idea of the hierarchy, that there's one teacher in the room when we walk into leading a class, as opposed to let's circle up and let's acknowledge that each and every one of us is actually a teacher and that any share or any question that you ask is a teaching moment if everyone is in this space of being able to receive and let go of, I'm the one who's doing the teaching.
And I think also, I guess I also want to bring in one of the kleshas. Like we could talk about all of them, but we just don't have enough time. So I thought maybe we could talk about the root klesha of ignorance or a misperception, vidya. And you say this, Vidya's favorite sayings are, I don't have time or space for practice. They will never change. And I already know. So will you talk about what's so significant about avidya and what misperception causes for us?
Yeah, so avidya is considered to be one of the five kleshas, and the definition of kleshas, and I'm sure there are many definitions, but the one that I understand is that it is a seed of suffering or a root of suffering. And avidya is said to have 4 feet, right? And so the everything sprouts from this idea of avidya, which is like this misperception, this ignorance, this not understanding, and it's really kind of like the film that covers our eyes, right? Or the you know, I wear a lot of coconut. I use coconut oil as my moisturizer. And every once in a while, I'll notice that my glasses are covered in coconut oil and everything just looks very fuzzy and kind of, you know, dreamy. And it's like, no, this is not the real thing. That I need to clean my glasses. Right. And so, you know, the yoga practice is really what, and our meditation practices, all our practices are really meant to clear the screen of the glasses or the film on our eyes so that we can see more clearly. And avidya is really powerful because when we are in this space of avidya, we're not in the place of questioning most of the time. We're not in the place of self-inquiry. We're in the place of just kind of being in that groove. And we can think about it as even the neural pathways in the brain that are constantly firing habitually because we do the same thing over and over and over again without ever taking a pause or making a shift. And if we're in this place of misperception, it's really hard to see that that's where we are. What's required is a pause needs to happen. There needs to be a gap in our thinking. And I would even say in that gap, bringing in an inquiry of, is this true? How does this feel in my body? Is this the same lesson that I've been learning for the last 10 years? And am I ready to stop learning this lesson? And why am I continuing to have the same experience over and over again? And so, avidya being the root of suffering, I think if anyone is studying yoga, to go back to understanding the kleshas and how they affect us. And the other four kleshas, not that we're going to get into them, are aversion and attachment, right? Fear of death, this idea of clinging. And so we really need to be able to see when those things are arising, especially when we start to feel confusion. I think if we ever feel confused, that's a really good time to pause and say, oh, what exactly is the source of this confusion? That's a really good way to kind of get into the portal of just seeing how avidya can start to color everything. And then our responses are covered by that. Confusion seems to somehow compound itself, right? It's like you don't pause to think about what is the source of the confusion? What is the antidote to the confusion? Start asking these questions. Usually we just keep going and then we make a choice. And it's like, wait, was that the right choice? Yeah.
I also would love if you would speak about asmita, this I amness. And specifically, you talk about this experience of loss, which I found really interesting, the way you described it. You spoke about sensations of losing and instability due to the sense of I amness. We speak more about that.
Yeah. I amness can also be, and sometimes is translated as ego, right? And so when we think, and in the book, I talk about this moment in time where my yoga studio was closing. And there was all this other stuff happening in the background of a relationship breaking up. The financial crisis was happening in like 2007, 2008 as well. And what I began to notice, because I started to feel this, oh no, my studio is closing, and my community, and I was like, wait a second. All of these things that I'm labeling as right? I don't have a community. There is a community. I don't own this community. I don't even own this yoga studio. So now I'm looking through the lens of the seeds of suffering, because I was realizing and feeling the gripping that was happening, right? This attachment, the raga that was happening. I was feeling all of the seeds of suffering, and I had to really sit with, oh, okay, I'm losing, at least it feels like I'm losing my community, I'm losing my studio, I'm losing status in the in the community, in the town, because we would bring so many people in. And it was like, no, this is all an illusion. This is avidya right here. I'm in the avidya soup, and all the ingredients of the kleshas are here, and I'm swimming around, and I really need to be able to see what's happening. So anytime I started to feel discomfort, right? And we can think about discomfort as another portal to awakening. I started to name, what is this klesha? This is a discomfort. What is this klesha? Is this real? And everything that I started to name, it's like, no, this is not real. This is part of my ego. This is part of the avidya. This is part of the fear of death. Like, oh, this discomfort of closing the yoga studio I can relate this to the fear of death. It's like something is dying. It's not me right now, that as far as I knew at that time, that was dying. It's like this something is closing. And if I'm disconnected from the truth of the cycles of nature, then I really believe that that's finite. But when I remember the cycles of nature and I remember that I am nature and that nature is me and that is really my true nature, then I know that this death is also leading to a rebirth or a recreation, right? That something needs to go fallow for a while and then something new will be born. And there's nothing for me to be afraid of. In fact, if I lean back in a restful place with this, I can actually be in the wonder and in the curiosity of how this is going to unfold and watch the unfolding and partner with the universe in the unfolding, as opposed to being in this place of resistance because my ego wants to be a yoga studio owner.
I love that, partner with the universe. And it reminds me too, what you're sharing right now, of a story. It was actually a very small little bit of a chapter in the ancestor section. And you were talking about your nephew who was asking you about his grandfather, your father. And you have these couple lines where you describe your experience of feeling sad and wishing you had a longer life, and that part of you being connected to your personality.
Mm-hmm.
And then the part of you that was like expansive and loving, being connected to the one that's partnering with the universe right now. And I feel like, I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, but I think I can imagine that being so helpful for any of us going through grief or the fear of loss, to know that we can hold both. That, you know,
Yes.
because I love that you weren't abandoning the part of you that was sad.
Thank you for noticing that in the writing. Yeah, it didn't feel expansive or truthful to deny the sadness or the grief. Even now, as you talk about it, I can feel the sadness. And then I can also remember the experience that I had after he died, which was beyond words, really, of feeling and sensing and seeing his essence and knowing that he's always around, right? And he's always watching and protecting. So we have to be able to hold both and not to be afraid of either one, right? Or and to be in our own experience in our own time without, I feel like, because there's a lot of judgment of how you should move through grief or when you should be quote unquote over something or healed. And grief, I feel like, is something that just continues to transform and ebb and flow, right? It's never something that leaves you, it is a part of us. And for me to be more connected to what my personality and the ego was, it's really easy for me a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, to see, oh, this is the personality that of Tracee that really misses the personality of my father, right? But my true self is even more connected to his true self than ever before when he was in body.
You brought in a little moment ago the elements and nature, and you speak of this from the Vedic teachings, Dattatreya, who became enlightened at a young age due to his particular master nature. Yeah, we just share about him. Anything?
Yeah, yeah. So Dattatreya was a sage who was enlightened at a very young age. And there were many people who would come to visit him. And at some point, there were some kings that came to visit him in the forest. And they were just like, how is it possible? I've been doing all this practice for so long, and this young man is so enlightened. And they asked him, we want to know who your guru is. And of course, this is what always happens, right? Is that even in modern day, is that we lead a practice or we lead something or we write a book even, and people are like, well, who's your teacher? Because I want to go to your teacher. And Dattatreya said, well, I have 24 gurus. And they were like, well, how is that possible? You're so young, you know, that you always have to study for a long time with a guru. And he said, well, my gurus are nature. My gurus are the elements. They're the python, they're the bird, they're the wind. And he just named all of these gurus. And some of the teachings talk about what he learned from each one of these gurus. And I took that as a practice for myself to just start to notice what gurus were in my environment where I lived. And I started this practice when I lived in Topanga, California. And so it kind of started with the bees and the birds and, you know, just watching the different animals and insects and noticing what was it that I could learn and what did they have to teach me and how could I also be able to honor them? Because when you really pay attention, there's so many other beings in our environment that sometimes we don't really notice, we don't honor. And so that's the story of Dattatreya. And there are many, many practices around this. But I write about it in the book and share some of the practices that I did as a way to help people reconnect with the nature that is in their environment, even if you're in an urban area, right? There's always some other beings around.
Yeah, I also really loved your compassionate and honest reflection too of nature not always feeling so inviting for people, whether it's, you know, their particular background, whether it's cultural, race related, even entertainment related. You were saying like horror films.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It was something that I hadn't really thought about until maybe a decade and a half ago, where as far as like the horror films, because we don't really realize how things seep into our subconscious, right?
Mhm.
And I remember I was teaching a meditation about the golden egg. And one person who was in the class was like, oh my God, I was so scared. And I was like, really? Like the golden egg is so peaceful. And she's like, no, I saw this horror movie a long time ago and it just came, it had a golden egg in it and it came back to me. And it's like, okay. And so I had to also think about for myself, my relationship with nature when I was growing up was very different. You know, we bought a house when I was really young that the people were gardeners and they had this huge garden in the back. And I was never allowed to go into the garden because the garden was like where the snakes lived and there were animals back there and who knows what's back there. And then when we moved to a new house, there were woods behind our house. And it was like, oh, you can't go in the woods because the woods are scary and people could be you know, so it's this idea of like some like big bad wolf is lurking in the woods waiting to get you. And it really, but I always had a love for the ocean and I would seek out opportunities to be in the ocean. We had a boat when I was little, so we were very connected to the ocean. My dad is from Bermuda, so he loved the ocean. And I feel like that was my portal, that was my connection because I love swimming, I love the ocean. And later on, I was lucky enough to be in a relationship with someone who had a very deep connection with nature. And so I started to really be able to kind of connect in a way in deep forests that I had never done before. But then what I also noticed is that my presence wasn't always welcome. My presence wasn't welcome. It was like, oh, what are you doing here as a Black woman hiking? Right? You don't belong here. This space belongs to us in some kind of way. It's definitely, I've experienced that a number of times. And so I think that we have to acknowledge that we can have trauma that is inherited, that's ancestral from something that we've seen in a film. You know, I was really young when I saw the movie Roots and I saw people, enslaved people running and being captured in the woods, and that also had an impact. And so I think it's a really good idea for us to kind of tune in and ask ourselves, what is my relationship with nature? And those people who feel like, oh, I feel really at home at nature, I feel really, and to still dig a little bit deeper to ask yourself, are you in an extractive relationship with nature? Are you in this relationship where it's like, oh, I go to spend time in nature because it makes me feel better, and I'm actually not in a reciprocal relationship. I'm not actually giving anything back. I'm taking, even if it's just I'm walking through the forest so that I can regulate my nervous system. How can you give back? And I think that the more we can be in that reciprocal relationship and that we can explore what our relationship is, the more we learn about who we are at our core essence in a very surprising ways that we would not expect.
You've also talked about, I'm actually going to quote you here. This is your quotation. Remember that there is a universe inside of you. If you want to experience change, you can begin by becoming aware of your inner universe. You can connect with the power vortexes within you, purify your inner elements, and balance your solar and lunar qualities. So when you speak about this, like becoming aware, purifying, and balancing our inner universe.
Yeah, this is so simple. It sounds really mystical and magical, but it's so simple. And these are the basic teachings of Tantra, is that there is a universe inside of us that mirrors the universe outside of us, that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm. And so when we think about this idea of something as simple as nadi shodhana or alternate nostril breathing that we've all done, we are balancing the solar and lunar qualities with balancing the Ida and the Pingala, right? Those two nadis. And eventually, maybe bringing awareness into the Sushumna nadi, this place that is non-binary, but is also known as this river of enlightenment. It's a pathway, excuse me, to enlightenment. So the very simple thing of thinking that, oh, there's a nadi, there's a river of light in my body that is connected to the sun, and there's another river of light that's connected to the moon, and it's the left side that is the sun, the right side that's the sun, and the left side that's the moon. And how can I be more in contact with this part of myself, right? Very simple ways in which we can practice Chandra Bedana or Surya Bedana, and we can start to feel, oh, when I breathe in through my left nostril and out through my left nostril, just for a minute or two, I start to feel this cool, moon-like energy, nurturing, sweet, nectar-like energy that is already flowing through me. It's not something that's coming from outside of me. It's already here. So that would be one thing. And then we think about, I think I use the words that you just said, power vortexes, right? And we're really talking about the chakras, right? These places where these nadis kind of merge together in these plexuses of power. And they all are related to the elements. They're all related to the Sanskrit alphabet. They're all related to just our karmas and our samskaras also are being held in these vortexes of energy. And so there are ways in which we can begin to work with these chakras. And the way that I learned first was by learning their seed sounds and chanting the seed sounds. There's other ways that as you continue to learn more, you might actually begin to chant the mantras through the actual petals of the lotuses that are around the chakras. And so there's so many different ways in which we can interface with this microcosm within us. But I think the first thing is to know that it's there and to have a curiosity about it. And it's really beautiful once we start to realize that we are everything that we see outside of us, we already are.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about this earlier in the conversation, this in a way, kind of the other side of it. But I still want to ask you anyways, this
Mm.
neti, neither
Mm.
this
Yeah.
nor this. Will you talk about this practice and its purpose and how to go about it?
Neti neti. I remember one of the first times decades ago when I did this practice, it was so profound. Neti neti is translated as not this, not this. Sometimes teachers will translate it also as not this, not that. And so for me, it is a way to create that spaciousness that we were talking about, that gap, that pause in the habitual way of thinking, right? And so you could imagine yourself just sort of closing your eyes and just noticing your breath and just feeling the breath moving in and out. And as you notice the breath moving in and out, eventually you can allow that to just be in the background, just letting go of the doing or the feeling that you need to do anything to receive and release the breath. And then as you're in that space, you might begin to notice that a thought comes in, or maybe a color, or you hear a sound. And each time anything comes into your field of awareness, just repeat silently to yourself, neti, neti, not this, not this, not this, not that. And feel as though whatever that is that came into your field of awareness dissolves. And so you just continue with that silently, neti, neti, every time something comes into your awareness. And then slowly start to come back, knowing that this is a practice that you can do literally for 2 minutes, or you could do it for half an hour. And it's really revealing, first of all, of, at least for me, what is in the field of the mind. What is it that I'm thinking about? Am I thinking the same thought over and over and over and with different shades and different colors? Right. And it allows for some spaciousness between the thoughts to happen. And when we have that spaciousness between the thoughts, I feel like we can touch in to something more true. And that's going to be different for each of us. But I highly recommend this practice. It's a beautiful practice also to do if you're doing yoga asana. And when you get to your shavasana, if you're with a teacher who isn't guiding you through anything during shavasana, to do the neti neti while you're in shavasana. It's very, very powerful.
So great. Even those, that little moment was very refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you.
You tell a story. It was 2007, and it was a massive crossroads in your life, and you chose to go to an ashram, and you had this experience with the sun.
Mm.
Will you recount that story?
Yeah. So, the illusion was life was falling apart.
Mhm.
And so I went to Grass Valley to the Shivananda ashram. And when I arrived there, they told me, oh, you're the only guest. And it's like I think an 80-acre property. And so everyone else that was there were people that worked and lived at the ashram. So I was kind of like, oh, okay. On the one hand, I'm alone. On the other hand, maybe I should be alone. This is like all the spaciousness that I need. And I had been doing a practice for several months at that time. It's a practice, a tantric practice from the Himalayan tradition called the Cave of the Heart practice. And this is a practice that really goes into the space of the lotus of the heart. It is very effective for grief and other types of things that I was experiencing at that time. And one of the things that you have to do at the Shivananda ashram is seva. So part of your stay, there's a couple of hours every day that you do seva, which is selfless service. And so I can't stand washing dishes. It's like the worst thing ever. And I actually have some trauma around washing dishes because that was my punishment when I was little. If I did anything wrong, I had to wash dishes. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to take kitchen duty and let the kitchen duty be this tapas, this thing that's going to create some friction. So hopefully I can move through whatever I'm going through faster. And I started doing this tapas. I'm going to call it tapas because it really was tapas. And eventually I started to love it because I feel like the people that were at the ashram were so in love with this selfless service. They had such a sense of devotion that it started to rub off on me. And then a couple of days after I was there, I think I had maybe 2 days left. They said, oh, there's going to be a couple of guests that are coming. And the guests arrived, and they were these two guys. They were like bearded men. I kind of waved to them, introduced myself, said hi, went on my way. And one of them was preparing the meals. He was going to be preparing meals. And I was watching the meal preparing was just really beautiful, how they would present the meal and everyone would start and they would stand back and watch. It was like this beautiful, I don't even know how to describe it really, like such a love of watching people take their first bite of the meal. It gave them so much joy and pleasure. So the next morning, I'm doing my practice, I'm walking outside, and I walk into the kitchen. And in the kitchen, I couldn't really see what was happening, but the sun was kind of shining through. And I felt the sun like moving towards my heart center. And then I saw that one of the bearded men was at the sink preparing for the breakfast. And our eyes locked, and I felt this energy moving from the sun through me, through his heart, and back. It was like this cycle of light. And it was so expansive and so filled with love. It was literally incredible. Like I felt like I have experienced what the vibration and of love, like pure unconditional love, feels like. And it would lasted just a moment. And it was like, there's nothing that needs to be said right now in this moment, because I know that he's experiencing something as well, but nothing needs to be said. And so I just kind of smiled and moved along and left the space. And, you know, in my journaling about that moment, and I write about this in the book, is that I was in the pain of separation, right? Of this relationship dissolving, this business dissolving, the me that I thought I was dissolving. And had I been in a vidya, because I definitely know this was a moment of pure clarity, I would have said, oh, it's love at first sight. This is the man I'm meant to be with, right? Because I'm feeling this, and I'm at the ashram, and oh, it's so beautiful. All of these things would have started to come in. But it was very clear that this was something that was my true self, that I was feeling, that I was connected to, that I was glimpsing or tasting in a way that could not be denied. And it didn't need to be spoken about. And now I can speak about it 16 years later.
Yeah, that's a really powerful move. That I remember you said you never actually even spoke to him before you even left. You just
Nope.
left. And
we saw each other from a distance, and it was like a nod, like, yep, we don't need to say another word. We don't need to talk about this. It's just like an acknowledgement and moving on. Yeah.
I so appreciate that for so many reasons, but also the ability to hold that energy, to not necessarily hold it, but to abide in it, rather than like it would be easier or habitual to make this word connection, to make something into something, and you just let it be as it was.
Thank you for bringing in that word abide, because that really was the experience that I didn't tell anybody about this experience. And it informed my entire next, I would say, year, where I could continually feel that powerful vibration, no matter what was happening. I mean, there were some really crazy things that were happening, that was the foundation. It was just like, okay, this is the truth. And I know this is the truth. So we're good. No matter what happens, I'll ride the roller coaster. And it really informed so much.
Did abiding in that for that whole year after help you make choices that you're still feeding off of now in your life?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It was a teacher in ways that can't really be spoken, but can only be felt in my body.
So you share about your Nana and this moment of realizing that she wasn't blood related. She's so dear to you, but she wasn't blood related. And I would love to talk with you about this, because certainly there's many people that don't have blood relations that they feel close with or have never met. And yet you speak of the ancestors having our back and being there for us, blood or not blood related. And will you talk about that a little bit?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we all have benevolent beings that are in our field, whether we are conscious of them or not. And we all have ancestors that have prayed for us. We wouldn't be here without them, even if we don't know our lineage. And so, one of the things that I do when I teach and I practice Yoga Nidra is I draw these circles of protection around my body. And I ask for the protection of the benevolent beings and guides and the ancestors that are well in spirit to come into the circle or around the edges of the circle for protection. And it's very interesting because I've worked with people who don't have a relationship with their ancestors or don't know their lineage, or part of their lineage is very secretive, that people aren't talking about it or haven't talked about it. And there have just been some miraculous things that I would say are just, I cannot explain what they are. Where when people start to really have a deep desire to know their ancestors or to understand their lineage, information starts to come through in so many different ways. You know, I have one friend who was working with me, and she saw an animal that kept coming into the circle, and then it turned out that her grandfather had the name of this same animal. I'm not going to name the animal, but they had and so in that then opened a doorway, because this person was never spoken about. That opened a doorway for her to go to her other relatives that were still alive and find out more. And then, of course, then the pictures started coming, and I had the same experience myself. It's like I knew my great grandparents' names on the Bermudian side of my family, but never had seen photos of them. And then when I started to bring their energy into, or to request that they come, because I felt that they were well in spirit, all of a sudden it's like these pictures from the 1800s are arriving that somebody in the family had been holding. like,
Wow.
So I do
Yeah.
think that it's important. And now, of course, because we have DNA, right? We have DNA, and we can find out from where our relatives and our ancestors lived. even if you don't know their names, you can start to think about and research the foods that they ate and start to bring those foods into your diet and start to maybe even go to visit some of those places, right? And just ask for the connection and see what happens, because I do think that it's a powerful request. And I also think that they're waiting for us to want to be with them, those who are well.
Is there anything you want to be sharing in particular today? Is there anything in your mind or heart or anything you want us to know about?
I mean, I think that for me, the reason I wrote this book and the reason why it has so many practices, because I often get the question, why do you have so many practices that you share? And the reason why I do that is because there's so much that has been held in the hierarchy, that there's this lock and key around practices that are meant to be shared. And I feel like there's each one of the practices that I share, while if you do all of them over the next 2 years, there will definitely be transformation. That if you find just one practice that really resonates with you or you become curious about, it's a portal to awakening. And these are all practices that I have done over decades that were shared with me by my teachers, or that I read something like the story of Tracee and then kind of created my own practice around that. And again, I don't feel like I created it. It was really like something that was a download that was already in the field, and I just was able to tap into, oh, okay, let's do this. That I think it will lead you somewhere. It will lead you somewhere closer to your true self. And so for me, this practice is this book is really like, if there was a time capsule that I could leave behind, this would be the time capsule of practices that I would hope that people would be able to receive.
And if somebody had to start with one, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think if you had to start with one, the timeline practice is one that I would start with, because that really is very powerful. It's one of the practices that I received very early on in my initiation into tantric practices. And and even before that, I had received it in a different way from a different teacher. Very, very powerful.
Will you just say a couple of lines about it, the timeline practice?
Yeah. So, you can think about this idea of what are the lessons that I'm tired of learning is one good one. And that's a question that a teacher asked me a while ago. And I was like, oh, this is a game changer. And you can kind of just sit with, okay, when was the last time that I learned this lesson or I experienced this experience, and trace backwards until you can find the very first time that you remember. And this can be done over a course of a couple of weeks or a couple of months. When I did it the second or third time, I did it as a journaling practice. So every day I would leave off at the timeline and then I would write about it. And then the next day I would leave off from that point and trace backwards. And when I got to something significant, I would write about it. So I wasn't trying to rush through the process of finding the answer. It was really more of an experience that was an unfolding, and it was very powerful.
These days, what's your flow of practice? What are you doing throughout your day? What is that looking like?
Yeah, my day is a constant flow of practice. I just look at my whole day as a practice. I begin my day with mantra and yoga nidra, and then I'm constantly doing vichara through the day, right? So if there's something that comes up that's uncomfortable, I will pause in the moment and I will try to trace back to see what is the origin of the discomfort. And I've been doing that for long enough that most of the time I can kind of find it pretty quickly. So that's one thing. I live in area that is very natural in northern New Mexico. So I'm constantly looking and exploring who's around. The deer are my favorite at the moment because I have a little deer trail that's right behind my house at the moment. And so we're in the season just getting ready to end the summer, and there's a lot of things that are starting to wilt and die, especially because of the extreme heat. And so I'm in that inquiry also always about what in me is dying and what is emerging, and just letting nature reflect that back to me.